April 1966. A General Motors engineer slides into a Corvair sedan that looks exactly like the one your neighbor might be driving to work that morning. He turns the key. Nothing explodes. No spark plugs fire. No exhaust rumbles to life. Just a faint electric whine and the hum of tires rolling across a test track in Warren, Michigan. And here's the part that should stop you cold. This is not 2024. This is not some Silicon Valley prototype. This is 1966, the exact same year the Corvette gets its monstrous 427 big block engine, the exact same year the Chevelle SS 396 is tearing up drag strips from coast to coast, the exact same year America is falling head over heels in love with big, loud, gas-guzzling muscle cars. And quietly, behind locked doors, General Motors has just finished building one of the most advanced electric cars anyone has ever put on four wheels. They hid it inside the body of the one car America had just been told to be terrified of. By the end of this video, you're going to understand why General Motors knew almost everything we know about electric cars today, 50 years before Tesla ever existed, and why they buried that knowledge so deep that most people alive right now have never even heard this car existed. Stay with me, because the reason this car failed is not the reason you think, and the twist at the end of this story is going to make you look at every electric car on the road today completely differently. To understand why this car exists at all, you have to rewind 2 years earlier, to 1964. Inside GM's engineering staff, a secret program quietly begins. This has nothing to do with horsepower wars. Nothing to do with chrome trim or tail fins or who can burn rubber the fastest. The goal is deceptively simple and, for 1964, almost unthinkable. Figure out what a car looks like without a gasoline engine inside it at all. Under Chief Engineer Craig Marks, this experiment grows into something GM never once advertised to the public. Eventually more than 200 engineers are working on it, split into two completely different teams chasing two completely different answers to the exact same question. One team is obsessing over batteries. The other team is adapting hydrogen fuel cell technology that GM had literally helped develop for the Apollo space program, the same program that was about to put men on the moon. Let that sink in for a second. While most of Detroit was fine-tuning carburetors, GM had a secret division essentially building spacecraft technology into passenger cars. This was not a marketing gimmick. This was not a PR stunt dreamed up to look progressive. This was a real, funded, 200-engineer program, and it produced 3 actual, physical, drivable vehicles. The first Electrovair in 1964. The Electrovair 2 in 1966, the car we're talking about today. And a fuel cell-powered van also unveiled that same year. GM even put the Electrovair 2 and its fuel cell sibling on display together at an internal event called Progress of Power, right on their own technical center campus. 2 completely different paths to the same electric future, developed at the exact same time, by the exact same company, in the very decade that history books remember as the era Detroit buried alternative technology under a mountain of cheap V8s. That contradiction alone should make you pause. But it gets stranger. So why, out of every single car in General Motors' entire lineup, did they choose the Corvair to carry this secret technology? Part of the answer is pure physics, plain and simple. The Corvair was the lightest car GM built, tipping the scales at around 2,500 pounds in stock form. And when you're about to cram hundreds of pounds of batteries into a car, you start with the lightest possible canvas. Its layout helped too. The Corvair's air-cooled engine lived in the back of the car, which meant engineers could yank the whole engine and transmission out and drop an electric motor straight into that same rear cavity, without redesigning the entire drivetrain from the ground up. But here's the detail that nobody at General Motors needed to say out loud, because everybody already knew it. By 1966, the Corvair was already infamous. Ralph Nader had just published his explosive book, Unsafe at Any Speed, putting the Corvair's early rear suspension directly in the national spotlight, on the cover of newspapers, in front of Congress. Corvair sales had collapsed practically overnight in the aftermath. And General Motors, almost by pure coincidence, suddenly had a massive surplus of the one car in their entire lineup that nobody wanted to buy anymore. And it just so happened to be the perfect donor body for the company's most secretive, most forward-looking engineering project. Think about the irony sitting right there. The car America was being told to fear was quietly being used to build the car that could have changed everything. But here's a twist most people telling this story get completely wrong. The 1966 Corvair GM actually used for this project was not even the same car Ralph Nader had been writing about. The second-generation Corvair, completely redesigned for 1965, had already scrapped that dangerous old swing-axle rear suspension for a fully independent setup borrowed directly from Corvette engineering. The car everyone still associated with disaster and death had, quietly, already fixed itself before this experiment even began. Nobody told the public that. And this 1966 car wasn't even General Motors' first attempt at this. 2 years earlier, engineers had built the original Electrovair out of a first-generation Corvair, ripping out the drivetrain and wiring in an electric motor believed to make around 90 horsepower, fed by a roughly 450-volt silver zinc battery pack. It worked, in the sense that it proved the basic idea was possible. But it didn't perform the way engineers had hoped, and GM's team essentially scrapped it and started completely over. Whatever they learned from that first failure was enough to justify building a second, more advanced car. Just not enough to ever call the first one a success. And that second car, the Electrovair 2, is where things start to get genuinely wild. Electrovair 2 started life as an ordinary, unremarkable production 1966 Corvair 4-door hardtop, finished in a plain blue reportedly pulled straight off the regular color chart, the kind of car that could have been sitting on any Chevy dealer's lot in America. Out came the flat-six engine. Out came the transmission. In their place, engineers dropped in a 115-horsepower AC induction motor built by GM's own Delco Products division, spinning through a solid-state controller instead of anything mechanical. And here's a detail that even people who think they know this story usually get wrong. This car had no regenerative braking. Zero. And that wasn't some limitation engineers accidentally ran into and couldn't solve. It was a deliberate decision. GM's engineers viewed regenerative braking mainly as a substitute for the engine braking a gasoline car naturally provides, not as a meaningful way to actually recapture and store energy, so they left it out entirely and simply gave the car bigger brakes to compensate. Up front, in the space that used to be the Corvair's trunk, sat the real star of this entire story, a 532-volt silver zinc battery pack, reportedly built from 286 individual cells wired in series, spread across 13 separate trays. Silver zinc was the exotic, cutting-edge choice here, a battery chemistry pulled straight out of aerospace and military hardware, manufactured for GM by Eagle Pitcher. They chose it because it packed more energy and more peak power into less weight than literally anything else available anywhere in 1966. To put that advantage into perspective, engineers calculated that matching this same output using conventional lead-acid batteries of the era would have added roughly 2,600 pounds to the car. The silver zinc pack weighed a tiny fraction of that. This was, without exaggeration, some of the most advanced battery technology on planet Earth, sitting in a car with Chevrolet badges. Even with that lighter, more exotic battery chemistry, Electrovair 2 still packed on weight fast, and this is where the math starts working against the engineers in ways they couldn't fully escape. The battery pack alone weighed around 680 pounds. Add roughly 315 pounds of electronics and cooling equipment on top of that. At about 130 pounds for the motor itself. Now you're looking at more than 1,100 pounds of brand new hardware crammed into a car GM had specifically chosen because it was light. After stripping out the gasoline engine, the transmission, the exhaust system, and the fuel tank, the net weight gain still landed somewhere between 800 and 1,000 pounds, depending on whose figures you trust, pushing curb weight up to around 3,400 pounds. That's roughly what a full-size Chevy Impala weighed at the time, riding underneath the sheet metal of a compact car that was never built to carry that kind of mass. So here's the real question you're probably asking right now. With all that extra weight, with 60s-era technology, how did this thing actually drive? And this is where the story stops sounding like a doomed science experiment and starts sounding almost impossible. It drove surprisingly close to a normal Corvair. 0 to 60 came in at around 16 seconds, which sounds slow by muscle car standards, sure, but it was actually right in the same neighborhood as a gas-powered Corvair running an automatic transmission. Top speed landed at 80 miles an hour, only a few miles per hour off the stock car's 86, and reportedly limited not by any shortage of power, but by the electric motor bumping up against a roughly 13,000 RPM ceiling. Range ran anywhere from 40 to 80 miles depending on how aggressively you drove it, which is the exact same fundamental trade-off every single electric car since has had to manage, and honestly not far off from what the very first mass-market Nissan Leaf offered nearly half a century later. Read that again. A car built in a General Motors lab in 1966, using silver zinc batteries from military hardware, was landing in the same performance ballpark as an electric car sold to millions of ordinary consumers in 2010. So if it drove this well, if the numbers actually worked, why on earth did you never hear about this car? Why isn't there a statue of it somewhere? This is where the story turns, and it turns hard. Everything that made Electrovair too impressive on a test track is exactly what made it completely impossible as an actual product you could sell to a real family. Start with charging. GM's own internal engineering report put a full recharge at 6 to 8 hours. Now factor in battery life. Those exotic silver zinc cells that gave the car its incredible performance reportedly began wearing out after only about 100 charge cycles. In an era before anyone had even thought through the concept of a battery replacement program, that's not a minor inconvenience. That's a car with its own battery pack sitting on a countdown timer, ticking toward the day it simply stops working. And then there's the number that ended the entire conversation before it even had a chance to start. That silver zinc battery pack alone reportedly cost somewhere around $160,000 to build, in 1966 dollars. One single battery pack, in a year when an entire brand new Corvair sedan, engine and all, sold for about $2,300 out the door. Sit with that number for a second. The battery cost roughly 70 times more than the entire rest of the car combined. The engineers who actually built this thing weren't shy about admitting it, either. Their own technical paper on the project, published through the Society of Automotive Engineers in 1967, stated plainly and without spin that the program had proven a high-performance electric car was technically achievable. But the battery technology of the day simply wasn't good enough, and the costs involved were far too high to make electric cars practical for real people. That's not corporate damage control talking. That's the actual engineers who built the car, in their own official write-up, admitting the math simply didn't work yet. And with gasoline running around 30 cents a gallon in 1966, absolutely nobody outside that small engineering group had any reason whatsoever to argue with them. General Motors didn't kill this program because the engineering failed. Let that distinction really land, because it's the entire point of this story. They shelved it because in 1966, nothing about the economics or the battery chemistry lined up yet. There was no fuel crisis. No emissions crackdown. No public demanding an alternative to the V8. So the Electrovair 2 went quietly back into storage, and Detroit spent the next several years chasing bigger engines instead, completely unaware, or maybe just unwilling to admit, that they already had the blueprint for the future sitting in a warehouse. But here's the part of the story that gives me chills every time I think about it. The lessons from this secret program didn't disappear. They just went dormant, waiting. When the 1973 oil embargo hit and suddenly created real, desperate demand for an alternative to gasoline, General Motors wasn't starting from zero. They had a decade-old blueprint to pull straight off the shelf. And in 1978, that thinking resurfaced in the Electrovair, a Chevette-based electric concept good for about 50 miles at a steady 30 miles per hour. From there, the through line runs directly to the EV1 in the 1990s, the car that would later become the subject of an entire documentary about its own mysterious death. And it runs straight through to the electric lineup General Motors builds and sells today. Every single one of those cars owes something to a secret Corvair experiment that almost nobody outside GM ever knew existed. And here's where this story gets almost eerie. The actual Electrovair 2 still exists today. It's preserved inside General Motors' Heritage Collection, and every once in a while it comes out for car shows and public display, still wearing its original blue paint, the exact same paint it wore rolling off that test track in 1966. In 1966, while the rest of Detroit was busy setting drag strip records and chasing chrome and horsepower, a small, secretive team of GM engineers had already run headfirst into most of the exact same problems we are still arguing about with electric cars today. Range anxiety, charging time, battery cost, battery lifespan. Every single headline you've read about electric vehicles in the last 5 years, GM engineers were already writing internal reports about 60 years ago. So here's the real question this story leaves you with, and it's not the question you'd expect. The question was never really whether an electric car could work. General Motors proved that, definitively, in a Corvair, 60 years ago. The real question, the one that took nearly 6 decades to answer, was whether the chemistry and the economics could ever actually catch up to the engineering that had already been sitting there the entire time, quietly, in a warehouse, wearing a coat of ordinary Chevrolet blue paint. If this piece of hidden GM history blew your mind the way it blew mine, do me a favor and drop a comment letting me know, and subscribe, because there is a lot more forgotten engineering buried in Detroit's past just like this, waiting to be dug back up.